Welcome, everyone. We'll start right at 1:01. We're just going to give everyone an extra moment to enter. Wonderful to already see so many people here. Welcome to those who are entering. We're going to give just one more moment because I still see the numbers are climbing as people come in from the waiting room. All right. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Over Zero and the Center for Inclusion and Belonging at American Immigration Council, it is so exciting to see such an incredible group of people here for a conversation about belonging. My name is Rachel Brown. I'm the Executive Director of Over Zero, and I really want to start just by saying how excited we are to share the barometer, the Belonging Barometer, and some of the key findings from our research today. And I think most importantly, to engage in conversation with an incredible group of speakers and with all of you on this webinar about the theme. This work is part of a long-time partnership between Over Zero and the Center for Inclusion and Belonging at the American Immigration Council. Our partnership started with work with communities across the country, and it's included partnership throughout the Belonging Begins With Us campaign run by Center for Inclusion and Belonging and related work. And this Belonging Barometer, this whole project ultimately arose from conversations with organizations and leaders that we partnered with over the years. So I really want to start by saying how grateful we at Over Zero are for this partnership with American Immigration Council. And I also want to just recognize and appreciate the tremendous amount of work and contributions from so many people that went into this research and to the report. First, of course, Nicole Argo, the report's primary author and the researcher behind it, Hamad Sheikh, the second report author, Wendy Felice, the former director of the Center for Inclusion and Belonging, whose ideas and initiative really helped spark and shepherd this work, Kim Serrano, who you'll hear from shortly, and Mohammed Naeem at the Center for Inclusion and Belonging, who did so much to get the report across the finish line and into the world, and then writing and framing insights from our team here at Over Zero, support to make language and design accessible from our partners at Delivery Associates, additional design work from Anastasia Miller and the American Immigration Council's in-house design team, and of course our gratitude to our funding partners, the Walmart Foundation and Omidyar Network, who really were our partners on this work. Lastly, I'll just say a word about why we found this research to be so important. For Over Zero, we sit at the intersection of so many different worlds. We work with groups and organizations in building pluralism, social cohesion, and democracy, on disrupting toxic polarization, preventing political violence, hate, and bigotry. And across all of our work, belonging emerges as a consistent theme in research and from our partners in communities and organizations. So the opportunity to contribute new research, and perhaps most importantly, a new tool for measuring and understanding belonging, it's our hope that it can be a bolster for the incredible work that so many are already doing to build belonging. And we also hope that it can support organizations, leaders, and communities across different sectors to engage with belonging for the first time. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Kim Serrano, Director of the Center for Inclusion and Belonging at the American Immigration Council, and our moderator today, to introduce the speakers and lead us in conversation.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you so much to everyone signing on from around the country today for this conversation about the state of belonging in the US. Welcome. We're so glad you're here. I'm also excited to be in good company today with some of the country's leading thinkers and doers about what it takes to build belonging. Over the next hour, we will hear from Dr. Nicole Argo, Director of Research and Field Advancement with OverZero, about the Belonging Barometer, a new tool for measuring belonging. She will also share insights from a national survey that used the barometer to take the pulse on belonging in the US in late 2021. We will then also have the privilege of discussing those lessons and deepening our collective understanding of belonging with innovators from philanthropy, academia, and civil society who have spent years exploring what it looks like and what it takes to build belonging. That includes John Powell, the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, who is also a professor of law, African American studies, and ethnic studies. And under John's leadership, the Othering and Belonging Institute brings together scholars, community advocates, communicators, and policymakers to identify and eliminate the barriers to an inclusive, just, and sustainable society, and to contribute and to create transformative change toward a more equitable world. We're also joined by Melissa Rhodes Carter, who is the Senior Manager for Community and Inclusive Opportunities with the Walmart Foundation, which is a philanthropy that is collaborating with organizations to build trust, deepen empathy, and encourage people to work across lines of difference in communities. And then finally, we're also joined by Michelle Barsa, who is a principal with Building Cultures of Belonging program with the Omidyar Network, which invests in strengthening the networks, emerging narratives, and everyday norms that help increasingly diverse communities grow in connection, respect, and equality. And we seek to be in conversation today, including all of you joining across the country live. And so we will do our best to be able to integrate in questions, and you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. It's a little box throughout the course of the next 50 minutes or so to let us know curiosities that are emerging. And we will do our best to address as many of those as we can as we are going. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Nicole Argo to introduce us to the Belonging Barometer.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks to everybody who has brought us to the moment we're at today. We are all really excited to begin this discussion. So let's start with the hook. What could bring hundreds of people into this webinar room for a discussion about belonging? And I am going to propose 3 quotes as an answer. The first one: belonging is linked to some of the most complex challenges of our time: loneliness, caring for an aging population, various forms of social and political division. We see them at the local, national levels, internationally, school violence. The list doesn't end there. Consider any major issue in society today, and you'll find that belonging, how it's distributed, wielded, or leveraged, plays a role. Sometimes that plays out in the form of individuals or groups that lack belonging, resulting in them being left out or marginalized. And sometimes it becomes a feature in tensions or violence between groups. In these cases, people have located their belonging wholly in one group, and they see the other as intrinsically different from or alien to them. This is called othering, or it's one of its definitions. And as stated in the second quote here by Stephen Menendian and John Powell, who's on our panel today, it's a part of conflicts everywhere, right? It undergirds territorial disputes, sectarian violence, military conflict, the spread of disease, hunger and food insecurity, climate change. So where there is belonging, there's often othering. And where there's conflict, there's often othering. which makes it really important for us all to become cognizant of where the lines of belonging are drawn within our workplaces, our schools, our communities, and our countries. But I think there's actually a more important message about why we are here right now. And that is that we people, we have the ability to shift the bounds of belonging, to create a larger we. And we do it all the time. So even on this call, already there are endless group-based differences. I bet we have cat lovers versus dog lovers, or pencil users versus pen users. Psychology has shown that any tiny difference can be used to other, but for the most part, they're not. So this reality is what caused political scientists James Fearon and David Layton ages ago to ask, or to say, the question isn't why is there so much conflict, or you could say othering or division or exclusion, but why isn't there more? All of us have the ability to expand the circle of belonging in the spaces that we inhabit. And in today's panel, we're going to explore a new tool that can help us design for this. So we want to introduce this new measure, the Belonging Barometer. We want to establish the benefits of belonging and the costs of not having it with family and friends in our workplaces or at local and national levels. We want to identify patterns and gaps in belonging across groups and identify ways in which a belonging-based approach can offer pathways forward at a time of immense change for us as individuals, communities, workplaces, and the nation. So how did we set about doing all of this? We drew on a large multidisciplinary review of the scientific literature to create our belonging measure. And given that belonging is a feature of various life settings, we assessed it specifically as it related to Americans' families, friends, workplaces, local communities, and the country. We then created an academic review team from psychology, sociology, anthropology, economics, extremism, political science, education, and medicine. They provided invaluable feedback, not just on the barometer as a measure, but also on our larger survey, which dealt with outcomes in democracy, social cohesion, and health. We collected these data in December 2021, so a little more than a year ago. And to our knowledge, the Belonging Barometer is the first nationally representative survey that links a nuanced measure of belonging to critical local and national measures of health, democracy, and social cohesion. Okay, so that was a big lead up. What do we know about belonging? Early scholars characterized it as a primal motivation, like a primal drive to form and maintain positive emotional bonds within a setting. As with most qualities that are wired into us, the need for belonging is underpinned by our ancestral origins. So if you were cast out of your clan thousands of years ago, you'd be significantly less likely to survive a tiger or a winter. Today, researchers argue that belonging is as important as our need for love. In fact, it's so important, it permeates our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, even when we're not aware of it. Belonging or lack of it is connected to how we perceive and pursue our life goals. So there's really nothing that we say or do that isn't influenced by our need for belonging. So if that's helpful or if that's powerful, go back one more, Mohammed. Then we need to know, how can we think about it concretely in daily life? And we drew on a definition from Greg Walton and Shannon Brady at Stanford. They write, belonging involves two parties, I and here, or at least implicitly an evaluation of who I am or can become and what the setting allows. It's a more general inference drawn from cues, events, experiences, and relationships about the quality of fit between oneself and a setting. There are a couple points to be made here. And the first is that this view of belonging is dynamic. For any single person, there is a near constant updating, an assessment of fit vis-a-vis an environment. And it's informed not just by relationships, right? Not just our connectivity. I could have great relationships in a setting, but still feel marginalized. Or if my setting is a geographic space, like the Grand Canyon or my backyard, relationships may not even be a part of it. There are a lot of inputs into our assessment, but the point is we're using them to understand if and how we fit. It's also important to note that we don't want to fit in every setting. I might not care if I fit on Wall Street or on the cat enthusiast Facebook page, right? So our need for belonging is salient in the spaces where we want to belong. And lastly, we all have multiple spaces in our lives where we might be looking for a fit. So that's why we assessed the various spaces in our survey, as well as we looked at belonging as it related to a prominent social identity for the respondent, although we're not reporting on that here. Okay, next slide. So now that we understand fit, the next question is, how do you measure that within a life setting, or what are the elements of belonging that make up a fit? Our review taught us that belonging is multifaceted. We often default to thinking about it as the leftmost column here, social connectivity, and that's really important. And the Belonging Barometer includes items to reflect that, such as feeling emotionally connected, having satisfying relationships, or feeling welcomed and included. But while these items are a core piece of belonging, if someone scored high on connection and low on the other aspects of the barometer, they wouldn't actually be able to say that they belonged, at least not according to the barometer. So let's talk about these other things. The first, and this is the middle column, is psychological safety. This means feeling free and able to take risks, to be vulnerable, and to know that no matter what you say or share, even if it's off the cuff or it disagrees with others, it'll be accepted. You'll be safe. Psychological safety has been around for a while, but it became a very popular concept in business after Google's massive 2015 study of its own team performances. And they found that psychological safety beat out all the expected factors predicted at top teams. So collective intelligence, power players, co-residents. They found that top performing teams have created a culture of psychological safety or belonging. And so the items that we had drawn from the literature that we then kind of mapped onto this popular conception are the ability to be one's whole and authentic self, feeling that others value one and one's contributions, and comfort expressing opinions even when they differ. So on the right-hand column is agency or co-creation. And the items that we include here are having the ability to influence decisions, feeling like an insider who understands how a system works, perceiving that you're treated equally. We drew, as we were scoping out co-creation, we drew on John Powell's foundational writing about it. And he argues that there is no belonging without co-creation. Since we are fortunate to have John with us today, I'd like to invite him to say a few more words about co-creation. John, would you like to share some thoughts here?
Thank you, Nicole. And first of all, thank Over Zero and all of you for this work. A lot of these things are intuitive, but what Nicole and others have done is actually add some shape to it so we can talk about it. We know that our voice, when we talk about people having a voice, it's not just the ability to speak, it's the ability to be heard. Oftentimes when we talk about belonging, people say, belonging to what? Dr. King talked about, had he made a mistake of trying to integrate Black people into a burning house. And so it's like, we're joining this thing, but it's not working. It doesn't acknowledge us. It doesn't allow us to speak. And co-creation addresses that. Co-creation says you're co-creating the conditions and world and places that you belong. You're not just joining as a guest. In that sense, co-creation is different than inclusion. Think about your children going to a school. If you're told, bring your kids in, but have them sit down and shut up, it doesn't feel like belonging. It's not their school, it's somebody else's school. They're there as a guest. And in the report, there's talk about belonging uncertainty, or you could say belonging anxiety, where someone feels like they're there, but at any minute they can be told to leave. So co-creation basically says, this is not my school or your school, it's our school, and we're creating it together. And it has many different valence to it in many different places of importance, both for changing the school, but also for the sense of feeling like this is you fit here. So you can't have belonging without co-creation. And so in a sense, that move takes us beyond a narrow concept of inclusion. Nicole, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you so much, John. Try as I might to do anything other than quote your words, I could never capture it as beautifully. Much appreciated. All right, so in our report and in this presentation today, you'll see us talk about belonging as a scale. And for each of the items that we talked about on the slide before, we asked survey respondents to rate how much they agreed that they experienced that item in that setting. It was a 1 to 5 scale where 1 meant strongly disagree and 5 meant strongly agree. We created a composite of all the items and split that scale into 3 equal sections that you see here. So on the far left, which was if after you averaged all the items, you came to a 1 to 2.3, we called this exclusion because you disagreed or strongly disagreed on almost every item. So respondents who scored here were in the lowest third exclusion. And then those middle 3 circles that you see here, this is the middle range of ambiguity. So people here either selected, I neither agree nor disagree for most of the items, or they had some agree and some less agree. So they're not in a horrible place. They're not in exclusion, but they're also, they don't satisfy belonging requirements of agreeing with these different items. On the right, we have belonging. These are people who tended to say they agreed with or strongly agreed with the belonging items for that setting. So note that we will refer to both exclusion and ambiguity as non-belonging throughout this presentation, given that those composite scores did not land in a affirmative belonging area. All right. So what did we find in our survey? I'm going to whisk you through a series of graphs that reveal the breadth of ways that belonging matters for Americans. This is, however, just a taster. If you are really interested, we report on a great many more outcomes in the report, and you can also reach out to us at the end of this webinar. But overall, in summary, we find that belonging is associated with thriving in the most important spheres of our lives, and conversely, non-belonging is associated with a vast array of social and physical ills facing Americans. Why don't we get started with the workplace? So I'm going to explain briefly how you can read this graph and all the graphs that are coming forward. In each one, you'll see that yellow represents strong belonging or agreement with the belonging items. And then the dark blue represents exclusion or strong disagreement with the belonging items. And these graphs were actually designed for effect, right? We're taking the extremes, the people who said 5 to all the items, and the people who said 1 to all the items. And we're showing you if you get low belonging versus high belonging scores, here's what it looks like on the outcomes. In our report, for those of you who want a much deeper take, given the fact that most Americans are not a 5 or a 1 on the Belonging Barometer in any setting, we are able to show you a little more about what this association looks like. But for all of these graphs, there is a model that shows a strong association between belonging and these outcomes. So here we asked Americans how likely they would be to recommend their job to a friend or family member. And as you can see, the likelihood is much higher for strong belonging employees. In other studies, using a variety of different belonging measures, workplace belonging has also been linked to performance and well-being, fewer sick days, et cetera, innovation. Next slide. Many of you are likely aware that Americans are reporting record lows in trust for each other and for their local or national governments. This is important because trust is critical for democracy at all levels, right? It nurtures political participation, it strengthens social cohesion, it builds institutional legitimacy. So we asked Americans, how much of the time do you think you can trust your neighbors, other local residents, your local government, other Americans, to do what is in the best interest of families like yours? We had additional trust measures as well, but this was a question I'm reporting on here. And what you see is a relatively high predicted average for strong belonging responses versus a much lower predicted average for exclusion. All right, next. You know what, Mohammed, we can skip this because I'm going to come to it again in the next section. So we can go to national. So let's look first at the graph on the left. We asked Americans how satisfied they are with the US as a place to live. And this is a set of bars on the furthest left. And then also how satisfied they are with the way that democracy currently works in the US. And as you can see, the predicted outcomes for strong belonging, again, are much higher than those for exclusion. On the right half of this graph, we also see that in some circumstances, Americans think a non-democratic government can be preferable. And here you see that scores based on strong belonging are much lower than those for exclusion. So that's just a few examples of the belonging associations that we found in our data set, but the takeaway was this. If belonging is related to so many outcomes in these ways, well, what is the state of belonging in the US? The bottom line is that a majority of Americans report non-belonging at work, in their local communities, and at the national level. Remember that we've lumped ambiguity and exclusion together when I say non-belonging, but on this graph, you'll see belonging is in yellow, ambiguity is green, and exclusion is dark blue. A couple standout observations. Friendship belonging shows the lowest exclusion, which makes sense because we choose our friends. And local community as a setting ranks last in terms of belonging. All right, next slide. It's important to understand belonging broadly by looking at overall averages, but it is as important to identify whether there are patterns or gaps between groups that we should better understand. Given the costs involved with non-belonging, this can serve as a diagnostic tool that could potentially enable us to address them. So to do this, we put typical demographic factors into a regression model. It's just a statistical tool that allows us to say, like, if I hold age constant, does economic status matter? And to say what matters when we put it all together. What we learned was that across life settings, socioeconomic status was the factor most significantly associated with belonging. So the better off an American is, the more belonging they report. But additional factors showed up across life settings as well. So one was generation or age. Older Americans reported more belonging. Gender. Americans identifying as a man or woman reported more belonging than those identifying as another gender. Sexual orientation. Identifying as heterosexual or gay was more belonging than identifying as pansexual, asexual, or queer. And finally, stress. Less stress was associated with more belonging across the board. It's important to say that race, partisan status, immigration category, and urbanicity often correlated with belonging in the life settings. But when we added socioeconomic status to the model, these factors lost significance, which means that socioeconomic status was better able to explain variations in belonging for these groups than the factor category itself. Next slide. We didn't test other systemic factors in this analysis, but we think it's really important to note that socioeconomic status itself is influenced by marginalizing systems. For instance, those that prevent wealth accumulation, such as redlining, or those that block opportunities, such as racism or xenophobia. And other organizations do excellent work revealing the impact of systemic factors on belonging and other outcomes. If this is of interest to anyone here participating today, I'm thinking of the Inclusivity Index at the Othering and Belonging Institute, and various redlining GIS studies that have tracked redlining histories to a current day wealth and well-being. So there is work out there on systemic factors and belonging in it, and it deserves a lot more attention. This was one of the critical takeaways from our work. Okay, so we're going to highlight one major theme or story from our data set today to get us started with the panel, and it has to do with belonging and diversity. Our report, we argue that belonging and diversity appear to be interdependent based on findings in our data set, and that each is best pursued in relation to one another. We choose this story because increased diversity is the future of our businesses, our communities, and our country. And diversity, in whatever form it arises, can become a fault line for othering sometimes. We hope this story will impart energy and inspiration to all of us on the call as we do our belonging work. All right. So, our first finding. The Americans with one or more diverse friendships reported experiencing greater friendship belonging and less ambiguity and less exclusion. So we also found, I'm going to pair that with a separate finding, that friendship belonging was associated with fewer feelings of local and national marginalization. And here, marginalization means feeling like a stranger in one's community or fearing that one or one's family would be left behind. Friendship belonging is also associated with civic engagement. So you see both of these graphs here on this slide. While we cannot say what is causal in these associations, there seems to be something important about diverse friendships and feeling connected to a community. So of course we asked, well, how many Americans have diverse friendships? The orange bars that you see here represent Americans who reported having one or more friendships across difference. At the left, the bars reflect difference by race, and then going rightward, it's difference by religion, political party, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and national origin. And you'll see that a majority of Americans lack friendships across difference in every category except religion, which still barely breaks the 50% marker. So our country is socially segregated, and we've seen that in many other studies beyond ours. In fact, there are studies even out of the Othering and Belonging Institute showing it to be increasingly the case. So this is tough, right? We're seeing this diverse friendship leading to more friendship belonging. We know friendship belonging is linked to these positive outcomes in local community and engagement. So what do? How do we increase friendships across difference, or at least meaningful engagements? Well, we can, of course, be intentional about this as individuals, but in terms of societal platforms that can help, one might be the workplace. So look here at the blue bars. It turns out that Americans are much more likely to be exposed to relationships with coworkers across difference through their workplaces. Further, workplaces have the ability to meet the conditions necessary for healthy and effective intergroup contact. So this is coming from decades of work in social psychology that really show good intergroup contact requires, multiple relational engagement. So an iterative engagement. It requires working towards a common goal, experiencing equal conditions for all of the people participating, and it requires institutional support. All of these things occur in workplaces, right? Or at least we aspire to them. So our point here is that the incentives businesses already face to create optimal team conditions may overlap with societal incentives. Strong belonging workplaces have the potential to influence Americans' friendship belonging, as well as social cohesion and civic engagement, while also leading to stronger productivity, innovation, creativity, etc. In closing, this may be one way that belonging and diversity can support one another in a virtuous cycle. So with that, thank you, everyone. I'll hand it back to Kim and our panelists.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I really appreciate the contrast of what John has brought us of this example of, are we inviting and belonging into the burning house, or what you've brought us, Nicole, are we belonging and inviting into a virtuous cycle? And I would really love to continue this conversation, shifting from some of, why belonging is important, what we're learning about belonging in the US and the current state, to what it looks like to do this in practice, and some of how this is looking across the country. And so I want to invite in our speakers, and you can go ahead and come off video for Melissa and Michelle and John and Nicole, if you're willing and able to stay with us. We'd love to engage you in this conversation. And Melissa, I would love to come to you first. Can you tell us a little bit more about, in your work, how is belonging intersecting with the work that you do, or a little bit about what has brought you to belonging in the work you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to share, and congratulations on producing this fantastic research that I think will be so meaningful for decades to come as we attempt to continue fostering belonging. It's so needed and so timely. And so also, Nicole, I think just with what you were talking about with that virtuous cycle, it was a perfect example and even definition of what we focus on so much here at Walmart and the Walmart Foundation, which is fostering shared value. So Walmart is an omni-channel retailer with a physical presence within 10 miles of 90% of Americans, and a customer profile that closely mirrors the United States politically and demographically. Because of that, we believe that we can play a meaningful role in building equitable, thriving, and resilient communities. Ultimately, communities where people feel they can belong. And now, of course, more than ever, encouraging people to connect with one another and work across lines of difference is critical for the health of our communities. That's our why. That's why we're here. That's why we're showing up in this space. And so now, how do we get there as Walmart and the Walmart Foundation? For us, philanthropy is one component of a broader shared value approach to affecting whole systems change. And whole systems change is ultimately our aspiration. So we are seeking to leverage our business assets in a way, business assets like this workplace, that will ultimately yield societal benefit. In February of this year, Walmart's Global People team announced a focus on belonging for this upcoming year. And as the nation's largest private employer, that really demonstrates to our associates, our customers, and the communities we serve that belonging matters. And when we put that emphasis and that focus on belonging, it can have an enormous ripple effect, not just within our workplace, within these walls, but all the way out into the communities that we're serving. But in terms of our philanthropy, we have several funding strategies at the Walmart Foundation that help to foster belonging. The area of focus for the portfolio I lead is caring and connected communities. And the focus is around social connection or connectivity, which is one of the key components of belonging, that you all have identified. And the aim of this work is to increase social connection in order to foster greater community resilience, which we've touched on so far today briefly. And we know that the research bears out that disconnection and non-belonging pose a threat to community resilience. So for us, we're seeking to affect change in 3 different areas around that: messaging, sharing stories that help provide hope and vision that can inspire people to connect, skills building, how can we give people the skills that they need to continue connecting across difference, and then collective settings or third spaces. What are those settings that people need that will really help foster that connection? So, we are really trying to invest in organizations that are helping people try to more effectively foster belonging and bridge divides and build trust in local communities.
I really appreciate, in line with some of what Nicole was sharing in these findings around workplace and the importance of workplace, the way that Walmart has been thinking about the workplace as an employer, and on the philanthropic side, the ways that these themes are weaving into philanthropy. And Michelle, I'd love to bring you into this conversation as well. And in that Omidyar has been thinking a lot about belonging and trying to understand this landscape and the current state. Could you share with us a little bit more about how does belonging intersect with your work?
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks to the Center for Inclusion and Belonging and Over Zero for this incredible research and the opportunity to join you in this conversation. I think, I was thinking back, you had asked a question earlier about, what brought us into this work on belonging. And I think for me, I spent most of my career working in war-affected countries. That was work that was part peace building and part state building, right? And what stood out for me was the infrequency with which those two efforts intersected, right? So you have this traditional democracy field that tends to focus on rules and institutions, and you have this peace building field that focuses on individuals, groups, and relationships, and to some extent, culture and norms. And what we fail to realize is two things in that. One, that institutions are made up of humans, so you can't reform the rules or legal norms without also considering the social norms that govern how people interact with institutions. And two, on the flip side of that, we have to remember that institution systems and structures are the containers that shape human interaction, meaning that as much work as you may put into mending interpersonal relationships or strengthening those relationships, there's no hope for social transformation unless you dedicate equal attention to shaping the containers that hold our human interactions. So for me, I came to the work on belonging out of necessity, recognizing that the advocacy work targeting legal or policy norms was not enough, and that the peace building work targeting social norms was not enough. But in fact, it was sort of an illusory synchronicity of change across the two that mattered most. It's this question of how you shift both legal norms and social norms in tandem in a way that manifests transformative change of the sort that we seek here at Omidyar Network, where we're working on big questions like how you reimagine capitalism and how you develop more responsible technology. For us, belonging is key there. It's the linchpin in all of this, right? Particularly when you're trying to shift social norms, because that's the currency. You comply with social norms in order to ensure continued belonging in a group. So the question that we're exploring at Omidyar Network through our Building Cultures of Belonging work is, how do you expand the boundaries of the group such that more people belong in a way that expands the boundaries of care? Because if you can expand the boundaries of care, you should be able to reduce zero-sum thinking in a way that enables the equity-focused policy change we know we need. And so that's how we really come at the work, is thinking about the interdependence and interconnection across spheres of economy, technology, and social life in a way that really tends to both the human element and the structural.
Michelle, I really appreciate that articulation of navigating the in-between and the necessity of belonging kind of at these intersections that are often kind of siloed in separate worlds. And John, I'd love to sort of bring you into this conversation as well, because I know you think a lot about those in-between spaces and sort of how multifaceted, how complex belonging is. Can you tell us a little bit more what has brought you to belonging work, or a little bit more about what belonging looks like in the work that you do?
Well, again, thank you for the question. So I run this institute called Othering and Belonging Institute. When we changed our name a few years ago, we used to be the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. And we were focused on a lot of groups being marginalized. So first of all, we found those groups oftentimes were slightly competing as to who should be the focus. So we worked on disability, religion, immigration, race, gender, and all of those are important. And in a sense, focusing on them individually in some ways encourage competition, like who's the most marginalized. And as the report suggested from Nicole's work, that in terms of feeling not belonging with other, the majority of the country feels that way. And that there's some deep structural thing going on happening, not just in this country, but around the world. The speed with which we're seeing what we call polarization or fragmentation is actually phenomenal. The speed with which we're seeing retrenchment in democracy is phenomenal. And to be candid, I feel like it can't be explained just in terms of individual interaction. I think in terms of surveys, it's hard to get to sort of structures and systems and groups. But I think the unit analysis has to actually, as Michelle was saying, extend beyond just individual interactions. So one of the things that brought us to this is that understanding that there was this deep structural thing that affected all of these groups. And we call it othering. And that all of them were struggling to belong. And their expression of that was different, but similar. And there were forces that were not just tolerating othering or fragmentation or polarization, that was actually promoting it. And the last thing I'll say on this, which I think, again, Nicole touched on, but I want to underline it, is that some groups gain belonging by othering. When that's the case, it's actually very pernicious, because if they actually invite or connect with a group that's considered the other, they lose their status of belonging. It's a threat to them. It's not just a personal threat, it becomes a social threat. And I can agree completely with Michelle that the containers have cracks in them. I mean, it's one reason that we're focusing on work, is that in a sense we've lost schools. We used to talk about schools would be a place where people would come and have this experience in terms of social contact. We don't talk about that anymore. We used to talk about neighborhoods. We don't talk about that anymore. In a sense, all of our institutions are fraying, and sort of like the last one where people might have social contact is the workplace. But even that's fraught. So I think both leadership, stories, and being fairly deliberate as we continue to pull apart. I think obviously the workplace is really important, but we're putting too much on it. So to me, the work I've done for decades on race, on gender, on poverty, belonging is actually a deeper way of understanding it, not just in the United States, but around the world. And I applaud the report and bringing this forward in a very coherent way.
I really appreciate the role that your scholarship, John, has played in the evolution of a lot of this field's thinking and practice around what belonging looks like, what othering looks like, what it means. And you know, Nicole, you're helping us in this conversation today think about and understand, okay, what's the current state of belonging? Like, how do we start to wrap our hands around this multifaceted, very complex, very important concept that exists in all these different ways? And as we're beginning to understand current state, I think there's also the question about, okay, so what's future state? What are we moving toward? What would be more optimal? And I would love to invite your perspective and the rest of the panelists. I will invite your perspective as well. What's next? What's on the next horizon for belonging work, given what you're learning from the survey?
Thank you, Kim. I think that's a great question and a huge one. So can we book this for another hour? The beautiful thing about doing this work the past year is that now we have a baseline, right, for belonging. And this measure is, of course, an individual measure. And to both John and Michelle's points, there are these other pieces, the structural pieces of it that tell us something different about groups. And I think one really exciting possibility is if we could overlap, imagine any kind of structural measure, the inclusivity index, or like those redlining GIS maps. Like, can we say that these structural pieces are influencing individuals and groups in certain ways, right? That would just be a powerful visual for a lot of us. We already know this, but it's something to think about. And I also just think that whether our primary focus is workplace, neighborhood, community organization, even families, the nation, we have this unique opportunity to look at change over time. So you can imagine natural experiments. Imagine that there's an election or a disaster or some other big event We're able to see that it influences certain groups in these ways and other groups in these ways. There's a lot of predictions we could have about how that would go, but that would help inform how we do policy or understand other perspectives at those times. And certainly I think, for those of us who are doing belonging work, to be able to track our impact with pre and post testing can be really useful. I would say that, at Over Zero, doing this work has had a profound influence on how we look at and think about our own programming. And we do research, but we do practice. And a belonging lens, once you have it, it just transforms the way that you do what you're already doing. So for instance, we have a program called Alabama Leads, which brings 15 leaders together from across Alabama to work on creating resilient communities locally and at the state level. Once we were in the belonging work, it was impossible to keep it from designing that program and co-creating, exploring belonging with the members and building it into the design. So as we explored it, the cohort would focus on how their communities often found themselves responding to the ways they're told that they belong or don't belong in society. And that linked, as John was just sharing, it's the core of all these other poverty, whatever the social issue that you're thinking of, right? And so one of the project goals for us was born from that discussion to build a curriculum meant to equip members with the dynamics of group, understanding what groups are, group targeting, helping them with communications to counter exclusionary narratives and to build the we in order to help them build those safe and inclusive societies. And how do you set those positive norms, right, around that more equitable we? So it really began to infuse what we were doing. And I think as we see philanthropy or policymakers or at any institutional level, as we build belonging into how we're thinking about the impacts, the people that we're trying to help or influence or co-create with, there's also this operational component of what does this mean for everything we're doing, right, within our organizations ourselves.
Thank you, Nicole. Michelle, I'm curious to hear your perspective on this question as well. As you're looking across the ecosystem and thinking about the work in these interstices that has brought you to belonging, what's next? Where do you see as the next horizon for belonging work?
Look, I think what's great is that you see the idea of belonging going mainstream in a way that you never saw before, really, at least in recent memory. You see it popping up everywhere nowadays as like a core issue of concern, something that matters to building a better future, whether it's around the economy and or technology. And for me, a primary interest is thinking about how belonging relates to a stronger democracy. And I'd say, we've done a good job of paying lip service to how belonging and democracy intersect. There's increasing recognition that the two are interdependent, but we don't yet have a common language or a shared framework for understanding how the two are related. Without a common measure for belonging, which we didn't have before, we couldn't amass an evidence base for establishing clear correlations between belonging and more traditional democracy outcomes. But the Belonging Barometer changes the game in this respect. And so I think the options are really limitless, but for me, particularly with the crisis of democracy that we're contending with right now, I think there's a couple priorities where we need to go. First is like for the social scientists in the audience, I think there's work to do exploring the overlap between belonging uncertainty, which is defined briefly in the report, and social status threat, which the data clearly establishes as a driver of not just social conflict, but democratic decline in this country in recent years. I think for practitioners, we have to revisit our theories of change to think more from a systems perspective, and systems that adequately account for the fact that belonging as this core human desire can be potentially unifying or destructive as a force. And for the donors, I think we need to consider how to better integrate and align our giving. We continue to remain siloed, with traditional democracy funders focused on elections, institution reform, rights advocacy, preventing political violence, all really important. Peace building funders focused on bridge building, counterpolarization, and culture change. But But really the magic comes in syncing up and aligning this kind of giving and change strategies. You know, it's like, again, it's this recognition that belonging is not just interpersonal or intergroup, but it's about having a sense of belonging in a system that is tasked to serve you. And people have that sense of belonging when they believe the system will serve their needs in equal measure to someone who doesn't look or think like them. So how do we come to recognize that desire and need, attend to it at a human level, while also mending the systems and structures that really promote equity in the long term?
Thank you, Michelle. That it feels like it goes back to that important point you were raising earlier, John, about co-creation and agency, particularly in thinking about the kind of system level interventions that are needed. And Melissa, I'd love to bring you in as you're thinking about the next horizon, and John, I'll be coming to you next. What do you see in the scale that y'all are working on these issues? What's the next horizon?
Yeah, so, you know, I think it's really interesting, the point that John raised about, we used to have all of these various institutions and settings where people could come together and connect across differences, where they could find that social connectivity, that social connection, those third spaces in our societies, where we could build that empathy, where we could come to understand one another. And we know that there has just been this decline overall, and that the pandemic continued to accelerate that piece. And so for us, we really are trying to explore, where are these shared spaces? And they could be digital and they can be physical, but we really believe in the power of in-person interaction to foster some of those conversations and that cohesion, and also recognizing the vast physical presence that we as a company have across this nation, and thinking creatively about how could we possibly leverage that. So for us, I think it's about starting to get a little bit more specific about understanding some of the characteristics of space that can help those connections grow stronger. Some of the characteristics of spaces that maybe are leading to exclusion, and then thinking about specific target audiences. I think that there is a sense, I think we have to kind of combat some of that hopelessness. We know that people think that things are heading in the wrong direction. We know that there's a group of people who want to come together and help bridge divides, that they want to diversify their networks, but just aren't sure where to start. And so how can we make that more real? How can we make that more tangible? Meet people where they are?
Thank you, Melissa. And John, would love to invite your voice in as well. As you're thinking about, you've been at this work for a while. When you think about the next horizon, the next step, where is belonging going?
Well, I think we're in a very interesting place. So why are we at this place in some ways? I think understanding that helps us to move forward. And what we know from tons of research is that rapid change is hard for people. It creates anxiety. And people need help in negotiating that anxiety. And that help is through structure, stories, leadership, interactions. And people can't work it out on their own. We just saw that, for example, in terms of COVID. And what we see is that the country and the world is changing very fast across multiple indicators. And that creates a lot of anxiety. And some of the stories is that you should be afraid of the other. The country's becoming, maybe there won't be a racial majority. Maybe in England, the majority of people are no longer Christian. And that's been weaponized. That's been basically saying you're about to lose. And so the narrative, how people think about this actually matters a lot. And it's sort of interesting when you look at the data, is that Nicole mentioned that the majority of people don't have a sense of not belonging. In some indicators, the group that feels least likely to belong are white men, which is surprising because we've had durable exclusion of certain groups, systematic exclusion of groups, not just at individual level, at a government level, at a policy level, at a banking level, at a school level. And the groups that were included are also feeling other. I mean, it's sort of phenomenal stuff that's going on. And so we need to do work and have an imagination and a communication and a structure that says the future belongs to all of us. We have belonging without othering. Right now, we have belonging based on othering. This is my country, small we, not yours, as opposed to this is our earth. all of ours. And there's positive examples all around, but we have to really lean into them. And leadership matters. I mean, I think Walmart can and is doing incredible stuff, because you really need leadership, not just top down, but to step up and help shore up those containers. And to be candid, to some extent, we're doing just the opposite. Co-creation and democratic engagement are very close. To some extent, we're making democratic engagement harder, not easier. And so we have to talk about this not as a red issue or blue issue or Democrat or Republican. This is what it means to be a citizen of democracy. You get to participate. Your voice counts, not because of your race, not because of your political affiliation. So belonging sort of undergirds all of that. Can we really have a story where we're not taking away from one group to give to the other group, that we're rising together and we're changing together?
Yeah, we could be at this for certainly another hour. There's so much to talk about here around this topic, and I just want to appreciate the leadership, to echo your words, John, that each of you are bringing into the work that you do, and express my sincere appreciation for the spirit of generosity and wisdom and co-creation that you've brought to this conversation today. I hope for all of us and for the folks joining in the virtual realm, this conversation on belonging is the first of many. And I'm also noting there's some really wonderful questions coming in, and a through line through a lot of them has been, what's the next step for those of us who are ready? What's the kind of practical, where do we go next? And I would offer for those joining today seeking a deeper dive into the barometer and the survey insights, you can download the full report from the Over Zero and the American Immigration Council websites. And if you're thinking and interested in putting the barometer to use in your own work, or seek to be in touch with the project leads, you can email belonging@projectoverzero.org. And in closing, I just want to wrap with a final appreciation to our distinguished speakers, to John and Melissa, Michelle, Nicole, and Rachel, for the work that each of you are doing at different scales and levels and in different ways, that all has this through line of deepening and fostering belonging. Thank you so much for spending an hour of your day in community and in conversation with us, and wishing everyone a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.